And if God said that to Moses, to do that for Joshua, then I would think that it would become necessary for us to encourage other people. Would you agree with me this morning? You see what my little thought here, I'm just sort of thinking through, God endorses encouragement, and on the antithesis of that, he also disapproves of discouragement. And I think if there is a group of people outside of your own pastors and leaders and yourselves that desperately need encouragement, it's missionaries and national pastors. And that's what I want to talk to you about. They always need that. Sadly, some people have the ministry of discouragement, and that happens. And, well, brother, do you have a verse for that? No, I'm sorry, I don't have a verse. And they all try to, well, if you shouldn't do it. And they may even have the ministry of discouragement. And you've got to work through that. But I've worked, as I've said, with missionaries and national pastors, and I get to hear their words. I get to be part of their conversations. I get to hear their prayers. I get to share their prayer requests. And so I'm saying I get at times to hear their heart. I'm not a missionary. I'm a national pastor. God's given us a great church there, but I get a privilege to work with missionaries now who come to Australia, and I've had several of them work with me in the ministry there. I've worked with other missionaries. We've had the privilege to send out missionaries. We get to visit them. And so I want to give you some thoughts on how can I encourage these people? How can I do that? Some very, very simple thoughts. Now I'm going to draw my analogies from 3 John, if you want to go to 3 John. And I want to give you some principles that might help us encourage them in this different realm that he's given us here. Some observations, really, that will help missionaries and help national pastors, some practical, simple thoughts for us. 3 John, here is a statement that is made. Look at verse 3 and 4. Here is what John, here is an elder, we can say he's a pastor, he's writing to some people, a friend, a beloved Gaius, maybe a convert, another man here, and he's saying to him, "For I rejoiced greatly when the brethren came and testified of the truth that is in thee, even as thou walkest in the truth. I have no greater" what? "Joy than to hear that my children walk in truth." Here's the first point if you're jotting something down. First thing you can do to encourage a missionary and a national pastor is this: rejoice with them. Rejoice with them. Rejoice with them in what God is doing in them and through them. Rejoice with them. Praise God for them. And here is what I would encourage you with. Some fields around the world are not as fruitful as potentially the area where you live, or some other mission fields you can go to that seem to be very plentiful in results of salvation and baptisms and people joining a church. There is some fields that are not that plentiful. And what really, really encourages missionaries and national pastors is when they hear some good news from a far country, which may be those who are praying for them or encouraging them, that they rejoice with them over that one soul that come to know Christ. Because in some mission fields, that may be the only one that they've come to know Christ that year, or that every 2 years. And so just that simple thought is very helpful. When they write a letter and send emails out about a person who you and I may just simply read through that letter, and it says, "Oh, could you pray for Mr. Asoka?" And you kind of think, well, what? Well, okay, pray for him. Who's he? Boom. You understand that person has a face, has a name, has a life, has a story connected to that, and many times we miss that. See, because it's just another name just another name thrown out there, or we had someone says, "Oh, we had all these people saved." It's just sort of, we miss it. If I said to you, try to imagine 1 million people, can you do that? Can anyone imagine? Has anyone ever seen 1 million people at one time? But if I said to you, can you imagine, I don't know what size your football stadium here is in Tennessee or somewhere, but if I said to you, can you imagine 50,000 people? You can visually picture that, can't you? But can you get emotionally attached to 50,000 people? Not too much. But if I said to you, can you imagine maybe 1,000 people? And some of you have churches, you've been in churches with 1,000 people, and you say, I can imagine 1,000 people. And I said, what about 100 people? And now you can start to get a little bit more attached. Then if I said to you, what about 15 people, 10 people? Now I'm getting more attached. What about one person? now you're getting attached. If I said to you, there are 10,000 people killed in a bus crash or a train crash in India, we go, oh, isn't that terrible? And it just passes from our mind because the number is so big and it just moves away. But if I said to you, there was a little girl killed by a car out the front of the Crown College yesterday. Oh, really? A little girl killed? All of a sudden, that single number creates a bit more of an emotion. And that's the same for the missionary. That single number is very, very important to them. And it really rejoices with them because I've discovered the people who I contact and have contact with, 90% of the missionaries and often national pastors, they often feel very depressed at the time, feel like they really haven't done enough. And they get the Elijah syndrome and they sort of think, man, all this money and all this time has been invested in me, and they start to think, I may as well just go home. Maybe there's wasting our time. And I want to tell you something, Satan slanders their mind. And it's very, very important to just rejoice with them. Send a little note. Send that email to them. Just say, look, I saw that last week. I had a prayer letter come through today, and I just read it, and it was about an incident that took place in a missionary's life, and he described something that happened to one of his converts. So I've already sent an email to that missionary this morning to say, listen, I just saw that, read that, and I know that must have been a great burden on your heart to lose that one convert to that, and I really want to pray. I'm praying for you, and I hope that works out. And you know what I did that for? Because I hope that will just encourage him and just rejoice with him about what God can do and is doing. Second thought is this. Look at verse 5 to 8. He said, Beloved, that what thou doest faithfully, whatsoever thou doest to the brethren and to strangers. Whatever you're doing this faithfully to the brethren and to strangers, which have borne witness of thy charity before the church, whom, and I want you to notice this expression, if thou bring forward on their journey, I'd underline that somewhere, if thou bring forward on their journey after a godly sort, thou shalt do well, because that for his name's sake they went forth, taking nothing of the Gentiles. We therefore ought to receive such, that we might be fellow helpers to the truth. Second point is this, not just rejoice with them, but also resource them. Resource them. Now, more than your regular support, and I know some of you may give to missions, and some of you are pastors and part of churches, and you get involved and you give that. I'd encourage people all times to think about additional offerings to help resource missionaries, especially in their field. When you have a little extra blessing come your way, you ought to think of things. You ought to think of your own pastor. You ought to think of your church. You ought to think of missionaries and say, God, is there something you've let this little blessing come my way that I could encourage somebody with this? And maybe give it an extra in the offering. Potentially even designate it if your church allows those things to take place because you've read something in a prayer letter. And you understand most missionaries try to maintain a bit of integrity and don't directly write to the individual members of churches. They send letters to a church and the pastor posts it, puts it up there, and he respects the integrity of the church, and you ought to respect that as well. But you might be able to say, you know what, I read that and I could help that person out. That God's just moved my heart to do something there. But the key phrase was this, they brought them forward. Brought them forward. Bring forward on their journey. When you bring someone forward on their journey, Paul talks about this in 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 16. He speaks about, when I come again out of Macedonia unto you, and of you be brought on my way to Judea. He's saying, you financially helped me get somewhere. You brought me on my way. Here he writes to Gaius and said, you brought these people forward. What's he saying? You resourced them. You financially helped them. Paul wrote about it again in Romans 15:24, that he says that we were brought on my way thitherward by you. In Titus chapter 3 and verse 13, he says, bring Zenas the lawyer, and lawyers aren't bad people, I was a lawyer once, so they're not too bad, and Apollos on their journey diligently. Bring them on that they be nothing be wanting unto them. And they have needs, and outside of their regular support, understand they have specific needs and other things that come up. Do you realize when a missionary comes back on furlough, that doesn't mean all his needs back on the field are all of a sudden not there. Many times he still has a building to rent. Many times he has national pastors that he's helping to support. He has different ongoing expenses. And there are things that take place there, and you might be able to say, I could help that person. I'll say this to pastors as well. One of the great blessings, outside of regular support that you may give or no support, one of the great things that you can help national pastors with in countries is resources. In many places, resources are very, very scarce. You live in an abundance of Christian resources. In our country, in Australia, as far as I understand, I could be wrong on this, but I only know of two fundamental bookstores. We have one, and there's another church that has one. I don't know of anything else in all of our nation. Now, there may be some churches have a few little supplies here and there, but we're able to ship some stuff in. Others can ship some stuff in at great cost. It costs those things. Now, we're quite a financial nation, as you would be, but there are countries around the world that are not financial. So if you hear about a missionary who's helping train a national pastor, do you understand maybe a good book that you saw in the bookstore might be a great blessing to that national pastor? Just that one little book. I can just tell you that, I know that happens. The other thing, if you visit a missionary on a field, if you ever get to do that, take money and give that to them. I'll tell you why. You realise when they drive to the airport to pick you up, it took gas money to pick you up from the airport. They got to pay for gas like you have to pay for gas. So you understand it costs to do those things. Don't be a burden to the national pastor or the missionary. Take a gift for them. We try to make it a principle. If you can, take something that you can leave with them to be an encouragement to them. We support several national pastors just in the South Pacific region ourselves. One of them had just been able to get a little building built. They've been for years just working under a pole structured with a roof, no walls, nothing. Well, he got himself a little building that he can have an office. I mean, we're talking an office about as big as this, about 9 foot by 9 foot or something, really midget thing. Well, it's in a very, very tropical world. He doesn't understand much about cooling and heating. It doesn't need heating. So we just bought him a little air conditioner, put it in there. You understand, he sent me a text and he said, Pastor Bakss, I just want to let you know, he said, that is such a blessing to me, and you are right, study will never be the same again. And he said, my family, which is 4 girls and his wife, we move in there on Friday into this little room, and we stay there all weekend. We think we were in a 5-star hotel. I think, boy, that all it was a little $500 air conditioner whacked in a room. But just be a blessing to these people. Send them stuff. Here's the other thing. Send them stuff that they cannot get in the country they're in. And be proportionate in your thinking also on the cost to send it. Don't send people who live in Asia a whole bunch of biros, because you understand where your biros come from? They come from Asia. They're made, biros, pens, pens. You understand? I realise you looked at me like, biros. What is biros? And also this, when you send things, before you ever send something, check the customs issues. Because you go send something, you think, oh, this is wonderful, and you send it to them and realise they get a customs bill at the other end for an inordinate amount of money, and they can't even get it out of customs. Because there is many times customs in some countries, it's not customs duty, it's sort of like, well, it's not bribe money, but it is bribe money. You've got to pay to get things. That's how it sort of works. We had one missionary, and we sent him a whole lot of, he loved a certain type of licorice, and he couldn't get it there, and we just wanted to be a blessing to him, sent it to him. Well, his bribe, or his customs duty, was several packets of licorice to the customs officers so he could get his licorice. So think about those things. Think about the wife of the missionary or the national pastor when you send things to them. Read about their children. Another thing too, this is a good verse for you to think about. Philippians chapter 2 and verse 25. Don't ever be embarrassed to ask a missionary what they want. Not what they need, what they want. See, Paul said, you know what, Epaphroditus, you know what he did? He ministered to my wants. You say, isn't that a bit selfish and carnal? No, they have wants just like you have wants. And I always tell them, just put it down. What is it that you want? And they all of a sudden, when they build a relationship with you, they may come back and say, you know what we really want? We'd really just like some really nice thick socks. Do you reckon you could get us some thick socks? That'd be really helpful. Or could you, maybe we'd really like this. And they just start to tell you. And if you can do it, be a blessing to them, help them through those things. And when you do that and you help them physically and financially, you bring them on their way. And you're a fellow helper of the truth. You're a fellow helper of the truth. Verse 8 and 9, he says, we therefore ought to receive such that we might be fellow helpers to the truth. And then he says this, verse 9, I wrote unto the church, but Diotrephes, who loveth to have the preeminence among them, receiveth us not. Receiveth us not. My third point is this, remain with them. Remain with them. And let me explain this here. Every missionary and national pastor has opposition and bad days. Do not think that Diotrephes people just live in America in some of your churches, and not. I'm sure you have them at times. They come in and out of churches. They also are on mission fields, and they cause problems for people there. And the missionary needs to know that you have his back, that you have his back, and remain with him through the ups and the downs of the journey of his life. And the other thought is this. The missionaries at times can feel, and this is what I observe as I talk to them, as they often have to write prayer letters back, which is a good way of accountability, obviously. But many times they feel like their life is like a trampoline, just as yours is. There are ups and there are downs, and after a while you can't go any higher. You ever bounced on a trampoline? And you're bouncing and bouncing and bouncing, and you just think, I just can't get any higher, otherwise you're going to bounce off the thing and kill yourself or hurt yourself. Well, that's the same that happens in their mission field. Many times they feel like I've got to keep bouncing higher, I've got to keep bouncing higher so I can appease everybody that wants to know what's happening. And they feel like I'm on the bouncing, trying to bounce higher and higher and higher. And they're under pressure to perform. They're under pressure to get those things out. I always say to some of the guys who, and some missionaries have said to me, look, could you just maybe write a letter to our supporting pastors and let them know what we're doing, just to sort of validate that we are doing, it is a bit tough, or there is some things here. And I say, I'm sure to do that, I'm happy to do that. But I always encourage people to say, look, just don't be too hard on them, just remain with them. Remain with them, have their back. They're not immune to church problems and issues, just as the churches in America are not immune to church problems and issues. Pray for their safety. Pray for those that conspire to bring them down. They have conspiracy people who try to pull them down, just as others here. They'll have Diotrephes. Sanballat and Tobiah wasn't just in Nehemiah's day. Sanballat and Tobiah is still around, not just in the United States, it's in Australia. They're in Australia, they're all over the place, and they're ready to pull people down. We had a missionary from our church, and he just recently, they had a property which they've got a campsite on there, and they're working with, it's in the third world, it's in Vanuatu. Some of you may know him, his name is Jeremy Pinero, and Jeremy's there working tremendous missionary. There was a dispute with the land. You can't own land in that country, you can only lease land. So they had a 50-year lease on the land. Well, the chief got a little bit upset. The chief came down and placed a leaf on that land. And the custom law is, if the leaf is placed there, it's sort of like police barrier tape. You cannot go into that property anymore. If you do, there's big problems. Well, they then had to clear everybody out, the women and children, get them out of camp because it got very volatile and potentially could have been life-threatening. And there was a whole big dispute over over a block of land, which was from a misunderstanding. Through that, they ended up having more chiefs to come in from other villages, and they all eventually came in. They had to kill a pig on the land, had to spill blood on the land. He was thankful it wasn't his blood, and spill that blood before this leaf could be pulled out of the ground. You think, just a leaf? Yeah, just a leaf. The police say, we don't even get involved. When security turned up and they saw the leaf, they said, well, we're leaving. We don't want to be here. They don't want anything to do with this, because they believe in superstition and spiritual stuff as well. And so they weren't going to do this. So they killed the thing. And there was a Bible there on Jeremy's table, and one of the chiefs said, is that a Bible? And he said, yeah, it is. And he said, can I have it? He said, sure, it's yours. Well, then the other 6 chiefs said, how come he got a Bible? We didn't get a Bible. And so he said, well, you can all have Bibles. And so he ends up giving Bibles to all these chiefs, which now has opened up opportunity to now get into all these other villages and look at doing works of God in those places. But that started from some opposition that took place that was very, very life-threatening. And there are times where you just need to say, you know what, I've got your back, mate. I'm with you. I'm standing with you. Let me know if there's anything we can do. And when I say, let me know if there's anything we can do, I mean that. It's not just Christian words. When I say, if there's anything I can do, let me know. And we want to, you've got to mean that to them. They need to know that. Number 13, or letter 13. Verse 11, look at this. Beloved, follow not that which is evil, but that which is good. He that doeth good is of God, but he that doeth evil hath not seen God. Here is my next thought, is respect them. They're doing good. Missionaries and these national pastors are doing good. And if Jesus went about doing good. He that doeth good is of God. It's a simple thought, but they're doing good. And as long as they're doing good, preaching the gospel, reaching people, respect them to be led of God to do what they need to do. And this is a very, very important point for cultural understanding of different places. Give them liberty to do things differently than you may do in your church or in your country, because not every country is the same. Every field is different. And as I've had opportunity, and some of you maybe, to travel to different mission fields, you understand things don't operate the same way in different countries. Diverse fields, diverse cultures, and cultures simply just means the way we do things. And every one of you have a culture. I mean, everyone has different cultures. Some people like to dip their peanut butter toast in the coffee and eat it from that. That's a culture. Some people like to dip their McDonald's fries into ice cream, and that's a culture. We don't do that in Australia, but I've seen people do that here. It looks odd, but that happens. But there is diversity of culture, and there is distinction in difference of culture. They are different, differing ways, different customs, different things. I mean, just have a look at the failed experiments around the world where they've tried to bring a multitude of cultures to live in one city. Look what's happened in London. Look what's happened in Sydney. I don't know what's happened in your country, but there is distinction and differences. And if you don't understand that and don't realize that, there is going to be massive problems, and there's distinction in cultures. And I would encourage you can make some rules for the United States that will not work in the Philippines. They will not work in those places because, they speak English, don't they? But their customs and cultures are vastly different. Catholic countries, Muslim countries, animistic countries where their spiritism is huge. Looking at those things. Give them liberty to work in a different way than you may work. Japan is different than Australia. Different countries are different. Australia is different than United States. We speak a similar language, except for the word biros maybe, or some others, I'm not sure. We have a different mentality. You have a conscript mentality, because your country was founded by pilgrims. We were founded by prisoners. We have a convict mentality. It's a whole different mentality. Different thoughts go through that. So just think about that, different things. Transport issues are different, work issues are different, work demands are different. So respect them. Verse 12, Demetrius hath good report of all men, and of the truth itself, yea, and we also bear record and know that our record is true. Demetrius hath good report and has a good account. Letter E is this, or number 5 is recognize them. Recognize them. Every one of us give an account to God, isn't that true? But we also carry a report card with us. This guy here, he talks about Demetrius, and he said, Demetrius hath a good report. He hath a good report to others. Timothy was recorded as somebody who was well reported. And so I recognize them and understand where they are at. I mean, think about Timothy. Timothy was just being faithful to God, serving in his local church. His pathway intersected with the Apostle Paul's pathway in a wonderful opportunity. Paul ends up taking him on as his disciple, as the one who he's going to train. And the reason he took him on is because he was well reported of by the brethren. Well reported of. It's very important when you look at people who are on mission fields or national pastors, especially if you are thinking of taking them on for support, find out and make sure they are well reported of by the people who matter. By the people who matter. Because you could get a report on me from some people and they may say terrible things. And then you get a report from me from some other people and they will say wonderful things. I could get a report on you from some people and they're going to say some horrible things. Get a report from people who matter. He was well reported of by the brethren. And look at who you are selecting as your missionaries. And if you take on national pastors, or look at how they're reported of by the missionaries who are in that area. Think about those things and work through that. Paul obviously checked him out, asked some questions of the brethren. How does he work? What does he do? What's he like? He's a faithful young man. He's a good person. He's faithful to the work of God. Paul said, you know what? I believe God's in this. This is something of God. Let's take him on from there. Now, I don't know what you do here in your country. It's in our country. Some people and some churches, this is local church, independent, autonomy issues, but some people have missionaries fill out questionnaires and say, look, we're going to fill out the big questionnaire, 15 to 20 questions, we'll scrutinise that, and if you pass the test, then we'll take you on for support. Now, everyone has their own right to do whatever they want to do with that. I'm just the guy who's watching the missionaries, and I'm sort of like the person coming back reporting to you and saying, well, let me tell you what actually happens. Let me tell you what takes place in those things. And my personal thing is I don't get anyone to fill out any report. I don't get them to fill out those questionnaires. If God has called him, then I'm not going to bring that calling down to a baser level. I want to say, well, if God's called him, I need to sense that of God. This is a spiritual work. Now, I understand those things, but if they don't pass the test or they don't through it, then I don't, people say, well, I don't support them. My thing is, I just pray, as you do. Maybe we should just pray and say, God, is this the person that you have? This is a spiritual work. This is a spiritual work. Are they well reported of by the brethren? That was the simple thing, because you question them, you can talk with them, and then decide if God wants you to do that. Recognize them. They're human beings. They're not the statistic on a wall or some other person who's a B candidate. It's not a job application for Starbucks. I mean, this is God's work, and this is spiritual work. Thinking through those things that, maybe the Holy Spirit can lead you to support someone without the form. I'm not just saying, just a suggestion. I'm an Aussie, so that's, I can say those things, I suppose. That's how we work it over there. Because here's what I'll say to you, and I know this is being recorded, and I'm very cautious of it, but I read the letters on your mission boards as I travel around churches and get to visit churches. I read the letters of the missionaries that you guys support at times, and I read them and I think, it's interesting. That didn't happen. It's interesting. And you're saying, what, are they all liars? No. Sometimes they're under pressure. Sometimes they just sort of evangelistically speak. Sometimes it's a little bit different. But I will say this, well, you know what? Maybe some people, if you say, well, the reason we do the forms is because it just weeds out all the unscrupulous people. You understand it's the unscrupulous people who fill the forms out to say what you want to hear. I'm not sure if you've figured that out yet. The honest people, well, that's what will happen. They will do those things. The problem is they fill it out. I've had missionaries who will say, they'll come and see me and they say, Pastor Bakss, they want to know if I should fill this out. What do you think I should say here? I say, well, say what you believe. Yeah, but if I say what I believe, then I won't get support. And you understand that happens all the time. They understand. And I don't want to hold a chain over anyone's neck. I'm just going to say, God, should we support? Is that person a man of God? Are they well reported of the brethren? And I understand your stewardship responsibilities, but I just simply say, recognize them. Recognize them. Are they well reported of them? And you don't eliminate a problem by filling out a form. This is a spiritual work. And may God help give us discernment to be able to recognize people who are well reported of in the area that they're serving God in. And there is plenty of ways you can do that, simply obviously through their pastors, through those who they're working with, if you need to, and then themselves, talk with them, engage with them and find out from them. The next one is this, verse 13 and 14. I had many things to write, but I will not with ink and pen write unto thee, but I trust I shall shortly see thee, and we shall speak face to face. Peace be to thee. Our friends salute thee. Greet thy friends by name. Here is the next thing, is remember them. Remember them. He says, I had many things to write, and he said, I want to see you, and I'm looking forward to see you again. A great way to remember missionaries and national pastors is obviously in prayer, without saying that. And I want to give you several prayer requests that you might want to think about praying outside the regular, Lord, please bless the missionary. There are some good prayer requests, some sensible things to pray. Here's one thing. You ought to pray that the missionary gets a good night's sleep. The national pastors get a good night's sleep. And you say, what does that do? Sleep deprivation is terrible especially if you are, and you understand that if you ever have that situation, the devil will try to stop the missionary sleeping, especially on Saturday night, before he's about to take off on a project, and it's a terrible, terrible thing. Just pray they get a good night's sleep. That's a good thing to pray for and think through. Why don't you pray God will lead him to people, the divine appointments in life. You know, Dionysus in Acts chapter 17, if you look at Acts chapter 17 sometime, Paul goes to Athens. He's there in the synagogue, in the church place. Next thing, he gets to the marketplace. From his engagement in the marketplace, he then gets connections with some people where he's invited into an invited place where he gets to speak in Areopagus, in the mount, in that area where there was great influences. And in doing so, his voice came under the ears of Dionysus. Dionysus becomes a great helper in that church there. And it was just a divine appointment. Pray God leads them to key people in the cities and the regions they're trying to reach, because the key people unlock areas for them to get to. So pray for those things there. Pray for his language ability and his cultural understanding. I try to help the missionaries that come to Australia to help them assimilate into Australian culture. At our pastors' schools, I often do something every year to help understand the Australian mindset, because they're trying to work with Aussies who have a bit of weird thinking at times. We're a bit wacko, a bit different thinking. We've got to help them understand those things. And language skills, language ability, like just that little simple thing with biros, for example. They can just throw somebody. They can throw different language stuff, and to get a language can be such a tough thing for people to master. I had one missionary one time, he said to one of his new converts, they were having a barbecue, and he put some steak out there, some quite expensive steak. And he said to this guy, he said, check the steak, will you? Now, when he said check the steak with his accent, the Australian thought he said chuck the steak. So he did, because it sounded like that. Chuck the steak. Well, he said, all right. So he went out and got the steak and chucked it and threw it. And he came out, and it was just a little bit of misinterpretation, lost in translation somewhere. I had another guy who was working with some Papua New Guineans. He had an old truck, had rubbish on the truck, and he said, take the truck down there with the rubbish and burn it. Well, he did. And the guy came walking back and says, where's my truck? He said, you told me to take the truck down there with the rubbish and burn it. I did. And literally, they do those things. So you've got to sort of think sometimes language, ability, cultural understanding. Pray for their marriage that it will be preserved. Understand the family pressures. They have the same issues that you have here. The devil reworks his intensity in those areas. Pray for his health, his family's health. When their children are sick on a mission field, and often in some places it's more vulnerability to disease and issues. And pray for their patience and endurance, that when they do go down, they don't go out. Because it's far better for people to stay longer on a mission field than to be in there for a short time. I've had 2 missionaries who've had to quit because of sickness issues and pull out, and very devastating problems. Others have almost died there because of some of the disease issues. And it's a tough thing. Pray for endurance for them. Pray for endurance for them. Give them time to heal as well once they go through times of sickness. Pray that God will preserve them when they're travelling in the mission field in different countries. Some missionaries have to cross rivers that don't have bridges. Some people are riding motorbikes that don't have motorcycles, and they don't have the laws that we have in our countries. And it's rugged, it's difficult, it's dangerous. Road rules are not the same. They don't have workplace health and safety laws and safety road rules. And so their ferries do sink, their boats do sink. They don't have all those things. So pray for them as they travel, as they're taking people at different places. Pray that they'll have a good friend on the mission field as well. Listen, even the Lone Ranger had Tonto. I mean, he still had somebody. Bert had Ernie in Sesame Street as well. So they've got a few. Pray that they can get a good friend. It might be another missionary, but sometimes they're so far apart they don't have anyone else. Pray that their converts don't go back after conversion. And that usually happens because of family disapproval. And in some places, if a person gets saved, you understand it's the denial of their nationality as well. Because you are born that that you were born that religion and it's tied to your nationality. It'd be like me saying to you, well, now you become a Christian, you're no longer an American. You wouldn't like that. And so in some countries you say, well, now you become a Christian, you're no longer, Chinese. You're no longer Thai. You're no longer this. You're no longer Nivan. Because they've tied it to their nationality. So pray for them, but it's very tough for them, for their converts, and they get a lot of pressure from that. I was at one place, they were doing a burial fund offering. I couldn't work out why they were doing a burial fund offering. And it was because when a Christian, when they got converted, the religious folk came and said, none of your family will now be buried unless you leave that church. And the pressure on that new convert, because now all his lost family members have now been not able to be buried in the cemeteries there, because the religious groups own the cemeteries. So he's under an immense pressure. So the churches would try to take up funds and burial offerings to help bury this guy's relatives. I mean, immense pressures that take place on converts. Pray that when the culture clashes with God, that they will follow God's way. Because there are many things that the cultures in different places are just their culture. Let them have their culture. Don't try to... I always tell the missionaries when they come to Australia, don't make Australians Americans. They're Australians. They'll resent you. Don't do that. They're Aussies. But where their culture clashes with God's culture, pray that they'll be able to change to God's way. Because there are some tough things that take place in those areas. And in some cultures, you understand it's better to lie to you than to tell you the truth. Because I'd rather lie to you than hurt you. Because to hurt you is a worse thing. So I'll just lie to you. And you've got to say, no, that's a bad thing. That's a bad part of your culture. And that needs to change. Pray that they'll be patient with each other, the missionary and the national pastor. When a missionary has a national pastor, he gets to watch everything the national pastor does, and the missionary sees everything the national pastor, they go back and forth, and frustration can come up. Pray that they'll work together, because sometimes the missionary offends the national pastors, and the national pastors offend the missionaries. It goes back and forth. Pray that they can understand their Bible, especially in countries that have very bad dialects, and the translation issues. Some language structures are terrible. I was talking to Jeremy in Vanuatu. To say the word piano, I saw a piano in the other room. I understand to say the word piano simply is this, and if I can get it correct, it's something like this. I want to say piano. They don't have a word piano. So here's what they say. Big'em box'em. So you get the idea, it's a big box. White man tooth, black man tooth. Kill 'em, black man tooth, white man tooth. And scream out loud. I just said all that to say piano. I mean, it's a lot of language stuff. Pray that they can, if just working through dialects and working through these people, they can understand their Bible. Some countries don't even know what a sheep is. They've never seen a sheep in their life. So helping them through that. Pray they'll have wisdom and boldness to reach their own people, these national pastors, especially their families, because of the struggles there. Pray that the national pastors will assume responsibility for the ministries. Too often the missionary leaves and the church just folds because the national pastor isn't ready or just hasn't got the ability to handle it yet. Pray they will assume responsibility. Pray that national pastors and nationals will find good spouses. Let me tell you why they need to find good spouses. Because once they get saved, all the rest of the people they know are in a different religion. They don't have a group of Christians to go hang out with. So pray they can find a good spouse. Many times they've got to win them to Christ. And that's where it is from there. And then pray they'll be faithful to their church services. Because many times their church services, you understand, Sunday is just a regular day of work for everybody else. It's not the Lord's day in those cultures. So pray they'll be regular and faithful to their church services. And then lastly, he says, thy friends salute thee. I would say the last thing you can do is refresh them. Let them know they're a friend and that they're a Baptist friend, and you can encourage them in the work of God there. They need to know that there are people who remember them and remember their names, their kids' names, and you refresh them when you do that. Just some practical thoughts for you, some observations that I've gleaned from working with missionaries, being a national pastor, working with other national pastors in different places, and hopefully that was helpful to you. Thank you, brother.